I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing Turkey and the dream of a new Ottoman empire in which the President Erdogan seems to be sleeping or sleepwalking into disaster for Turkey and for the region. The Erdogan era began, in the words of his then Foreign Minister Davutoglu, that they wished no quarrels with the neighbours, and indeed wished a peace process with a substantial section of their own population. All of that now lies in ruins. There are quarrels, if not wars, with all of the neighbours, and the peace process is long abandoned. The Kurdish people are again at war inside Turkey, and Turkey is at war or near to it with all of its neighbours, including most notably in the areas of Syria that it currently occupies or facilitates the occupation of foreign powers. But it hasn't stopped with its immediate neighbours, not stopped with its interference, constant interference in Iraq, not stopped even in Arab countries. It recently fueled and armed the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, a role that it shared with Azerbaijan's ally Israel. And the Libyan farrago, which is still ongoing, is another of Erdogan's foreign adventures. Libya, just a few years ago, was the richest place in Africa. Now it is a place where you can buy an African slave in a slave market. Turkey has moved in with its ideology and with its soldiers and with its mercenaries, just like in Azerbaijan, and is interfering now directly on the ground in the wars in an African and Arab country. I was one of those who thought that Erdogan might be just what the doctor ordered for Turkey. His achievements, impressive as they were in the economy and the foreign policy which he earlier enunciated, were things that I thought would be an improvement. But all of that turned out to be bluster. Erdogan denounces everyone else for their open or quasi-open relations with Israel, whilst enjoying the most glorious of relations with Israel himself, sharing with Israel many of the foreign policy preoccupations, particularly in Syria. Erdogan was feeding the beasts of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the north, while Israel was literally feeding the beasts in the south. I'm joined by an audience of distinguished experts. I'm just the enthusiastic amateur in this conversation. Our guests here can bring first-hand examples of what might become of this dream of a new Ottoman empire. Dr. Abdulaziz Agniea is a Libyan broadcaster, a commentator, and a political analyst of the first rank. I've known him for many years. He believes in reconciliation as the way to rebuild Libya in peace and law and order. Dr. Abdulaziz, welcome back onto the show. What role is Turkey playing in Libya these days?
First of all, let me put one point for all Libyans, that the problem in Libya is our problems, and we need to solve it by our hands. Despite all the external intervention in Libya since 2011, we're still in chaos, and they take advantage of us, many either neighbor countries or just like Turkey today. Turkey today, they feed the country with mercenary. They try to dream about. They talk about Ottoman Empire. They talk about even some Libyans who've been in Libya for a long time. We never know that they are belong to Turkey. Now he is tried to interfere in the Libyan society and segregate us as one part is a Turkish because their grand ancestor of the Turkish Ottoman Empire in Libya 400 years ago. So he tried to manipulate even some sort of helper or try to bring Turkey to Libya, who's controlling Tripoli and west part of Libya. And everybody know, even the United Nations, they know that the mercenary, the militia, the armed militia, they are hostage to Tripoli. They are not cover Tripoli. We know that many people, many militias, they are opening the slave markets. Those who open the slave markets. So on one hand, the Turkey is feeding this beast who is trade in human being in 21st century. But when he put his leg in Libya, must be amputated by Libyan patriot. Yes, there is a difference between Libyan parties now, but in their deep heart, still Omar al-Mukhtar is an icon of a freedom against colonialism, still live in every Libyan dream and every Libyan mind. So one day or the other, they will kick the Turkish, despite he's bring the mercenary, despite the bring military. He forgetting that the oil and the money in Libya is contracted to many international companies, either Enigas or British Petroleum or Total or any of those international, multi-international companies, still safe. There, nobody try to manipulate, even with the contracts. He now tried to occupy his west part of Libya because he promised the Turkish people that he will get advantage of the oil and the money.
Well, he's even trying to get his hands on Cyprus's oil, Greek oil. So he does have, and of course he's facilitating the stealing of Syrian oil on a very grand scale.
Even the Kurdish oil in Iraq, the main, he started stealing that as well. So from the Kurdistan, Iraq, there is a pipe of the trucks moving toward Turkey, and he's selling that. That's why.
So oil is one motive, but isn't the underlying motive this conflict between Turkey and Saudi Arabia for the affections and fealty, loyalty of the Sunni Arab Muslim mass? The Erdogan, let's call a spade, is the head of the Muslim Brotherhood. They are in conflict with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. It's a pity they both can't lose in that conflict. But it's partly geopolitics, isn't it?
Yes, he tried to use the Brotherhood. Now the Brotherhood, they tried to use Erdogan as a head to establish themselves in North Africa. Because the Libyan National Army, when they move against the Muslim Brotherhood, who's controlling the east and using the armed militia in west part of Libya, if the Brotherhood die in Libya, that means they will die in Tunisia and Algeria and also in Morocco. So the Brotherhood lifeline now is together with Erdogan. That's why they're bringing Erdogan to Libya to establish themselves institutionally for whole north of Africa. They have problem with Egypt, so they're fighting with Egypt. If the Egypt win the war and they make peace in Libya, that means the Brotherhood will die. There is also united between, let's say, stagely united, not continuous, between Erdogan and Qatar and the Brotherhood. And they feed the Brotherhood because they need to take advantage of these countries. So the Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates against the Brotherhood, because the Brotherhood, they like to take over those regions. If they take over this region, so become the matter of the who's sitting or rule this region. So that's why there is a big problem between Brotherhood and in the Gulf states, or between the Brotherhood and using Erdogan to control these things. Because we know the Brotherhood, Arab Brotherhood, the main hub for them is Egypt, because they lost Egypt. Now they struggle to grab everything. They use the fascists, Muslim fascists, jihadists. They use those parties to establish themselves or to integrate in the society. Libya, because it's still fragile since 10 years, still moving, still flaming and fighting. So the Brotherhood, they try to use this surface flammable to go deeper inside and to create new members for their parties. But because with their miss to manipulate the country, not like Brotherhood in Tunis. For example, Brotherhood in Tunis, they didn't come down to the street to fight and to flame everything like what they did in Libya. In Tunis, they still there fighting against who's controlled the parliament, who's controlled the government, and they are playing with the little margin of risk. In Libya, the completely disaster,
it's
and with the bring Erdogan,
a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
Ella Rule, you are the leader of Britain's communists. How do you view the role of Erdogan in places like Libya?
Well, listening to the last speaker, one of the things which struck me is that it wasn't Turkey that caused the bombing and the overthrow of Gaddafi. It was NATO, and it was British. Well,
Turkey is a member of NATO, of course.
Of course, but basically it was US imperialism that drove that. And what it seems to me now is that Erdogan is being used as a cat's paw to prevent the Libyan people themselves from taking back control of their country. I mean, the vast majority of ordinary Libyans, as I understand it, are supporting of Haftar, who at least is a nationalist, who at least would want to maintain control over the country's assets for the benefit of the Libyan people and to restore what it used to have, its high standard of living, its support for the surrounding countries. That's what Haftar is seen as, and that's why Haftar is the enemy as far as imperialism is concerned. Everyone wants Haftar defeated. But here comes Turkey, all happy to, send Italians to go and get themselves killed in the interests of keeping Haftar out. So as far as I'm concerned, there's a level at which Erdogan is just a cat's paw.
Sure, but he is reaching in every direction.
Oh, yeah.
And thus the thesis that he's seeking to recreate the Ottoman Empire bears examination, doesn't it?
Oh, well, yes, he can seek. But whether he'll get remains to be seen.
His forces are in Iraq, his forces are in Syria, his navy is menacing Cyprus and Greece, his forces are in Azerbaijan, and now they're in Libya. That is quite a reach. Harpar Brar, you're a veteran politician and author. How does it look to you from this distance?
What I look at it, George, and thank you for having me on this program, and what I look at it is that really behind all that, Ella Rule is quite right, you must see the hand of US imperialism and its junior imperialist allies. Erdogan is somebody who's unleashed on the region by imperialism, but there comes a time when contradictions arise between the flunky and the master. And they're not always singing from the same hymn sheet. So everywhere you see something done by Erdogan, it looks all right. Like you said, you thought he might change Turkey for the better. And on the other hand, the following day, he'll do something just the opposite. When you look at the whole map of the Middle East, which we must do, there is an alliance, there's a coalition of the arch-reactionary and counter-revolutionary forces headed by US imperialism. Israel, Saudi Arabia, Erdogan all want to overthrow the Iranian regime. Whether you agree with the Iranian regime or not, it is an anti-imperialist regime and has been a thorn in the side of imperialism ever since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. On that, they are all agreed. So there's a kind of tacit collaboration between Israel and Erdogan in the case of Syria. And then there are other areas on the question of Saudi Arabia. They're all quietly working towards the recognition of Israel. Now, in my view, notwithstanding the fact it's a kick in the teeth of the Palestinian people fighting for their liberation, these recognitions mean absolutely nothing. In the end, Palestine will be liberated by the Palestinian people, and it'll be liberated by them resisting occupation. Now, what Erdogan, being the fool he is, hasn't learned, he could have learned from Israel. They both want to colonize various areas of the Middle East. Israelis are colonizing Palestinian lands, and Erdogan wants to do parts of Syria, parts of Libya, but they've come too late for the age of colonialism. Colonialism went out of fashion, at least by the 1960s, and their attempts to colonize these areas will not get anywhere. Erdogan tries to get himself some leeway by having some kind of uneasy relations with Putin's Russia. But it doesn't always work like that, because everywhere he's in contradiction with the Russians, in the case of Libya, in the case of Azerbaijan, in the case of Syria. And I think he's grown far too big for his boots, and he'll come a cropper. Last time he was saved from overthrow by his own army and civilian people, thanks to the Russians giving him information, get out of wherever you are, otherwise you are in trouble. And they might not want to do that next time. There's nothing humanitarian about their interventions. They don't give a damn about their own people, let alone going and helping people in Libya or Syria. It's all about oil, it's all about having spheres of influence, and it's all about looting other people's wealth.
Let's go to the United States, to New York, to meet a man that I first came across in the struggle to try and stop the war on Iraq. Although a former US Marines intelligence officer and a former arms inspector, he came to see and came to speak, more importantly, about the lies that led up to the invasion and occupation of Iraq. He is, of course, Scott Ritter, and he joins us now from New York. Welcome, Scott. Who caused the chaos in Libya? Who should be blamed?
Well, it's a combination of factors, but it's basically the United States together with France and Europe. Whether you like Muammar Gaddafi or not, he was the leader of a sovereign nation. And from any standpoint, one could say that he was leading successfully, especially if you compare and contrast Libya under his rule and Libya today. But the blame rests solely on the United States, France, and Europe, who intervened in the affairs of a sovereign state with the sole intent of removing a sovereign leader from power.
It was the Western powers that brought this chaos to Libya. So how did it end up where Russia and Turkey are the powers on the ground?
Well, as is the case in almost every intervention that the United States has led that leads to regime change, we are soon confronted with the failure of our intervention. The fact that what we replaced is far better than what we seek to replace it with, and then we abandon ship, and that's what happened in Libya. We quickly disengaged in Libya, leaving chaos and anarchy in our wake. And then what happens is the state that remains falls back on its historical foundations. And Libya is a state that historically has two primary areas, one operating out of Tripoli, one out of Benghazi. And it also, we tend to forget that, Libya used to be part of the Ottoman Empire with deep cultural, historical ties to Turkey. And in this vacuum, Turkey has sought to reassert itself, not only for the benefit of Libya, but also for selfish reasons, taking advantage of the Libyan chaos to create a maritime border with Libya that Turkey is using to assert its rights in terms of underwater energy exploration, et cetera. So, this is why we see Turkey as a major player. We also see Russia seeking to inject itself into the situation to rebuild its Cold War presence in the area to make Russia a Mediterranean power. So, again, none of this would have happened if we had just let Muammar Gaddafi stay in power. But this is the state of affairs today.
Could Western powers intervene again in Libya in the current circumstances?
NATO was created in a Cold War environment to stop a threat that, frankly speaking, didn't exist. I mean, the idea was to keep Russia out of Europe by creating this military alliance. Russia had no intention of invading Western Europe. Yes, Turkey, Greece were nations where Russia was involved in, supporting domestic political change from forces inside that, might lend themselves towards, a Russian belief system, a communist belief system. And so we supported Turkey, we supported Greece's efforts to prevent that, and we brought them into this alliance. But those were artificial additions. NATO was primarily a transatlantic alliance between Western Europe and the United States. Turkey and Greece have always been, sort of artificial add-ons brought into as part of the process of containing Russia. But Turkey has its own regional aspirations, especially in the coming to power of Recep Erdogan, an autocratic leader who has distanced himself from the Kemalist Western leanings that are traditionally part of post-Ottoman Turkey. But yeah, in NATO today, with the Soviet Union collapse, NATO today is a alliance in search of a mission, and that mission has put its in direct confrontation with one of its members, Turkey.
Is Turkey really trying to reestablish the Ottoman Empire? Why else would they be in Libya?
Well, not just Libyan intervention, Syrian intervention in Azerbaijan, muscle flexing in Turkey, in Iraq, in northern Iraq. We should never forget that Turkey was, is, and always will be an Islamic state. We forget that Ottomanism wasn't about pan-Turkism as it was about pan-Islam, where Turkey sat at the head of a pan-Islamic empire, alliance, etc. After the Turkish Revolution and the forming of the Turkish Republic, the West tend to view Turkey as a singularity, this pro-Western secular state that was aligned with Western values. That's just not the case. Turkey is an expression and will continue to be an expression of pan-Islamic values, pan-Islamic aspirations, and Turkey's intervention in Libya is the modern manifestation of this.
We'll be right back after this with much more debate. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, talking about Libya, talking about Turkey and its ever farther reaching empire building. Dr. Agniea, actually Erdogan's support is some 45% or so of the Turkish people on most tests. And therefore, he has made an alliance with the Turkish nationalists, some of the most extreme elements in Turkey, these grey wolves and so on. Yeah. So in fact, Turkey is best understood now as an Islamist, Turkish nationalist hybrid, isn't it?
Not really, because it's what bring Turkish people to the Islam nowadays, because the Kemal Ataturk, who is the dream leader for the Grey Wolf, which is the most nationalist, actually they strip Islam or the value of Islam from Turkey. Now most of the people, Turkish people who support Erdogan now is in a rural area where they like to wear hijab, where they wear some sort of practical Islam in their society, which has been banned for years. But Erdogan itself is made like the colonial party or the political party who control Hungary or Poland nowadays, because they withdraw themselves from the Geneva contract or intervention, saying that they protect women's rights. So he froze that part is his country, which is to give the freedom for the women to speak, to wear whatever they like, to do whatever they like with their lives. So he had two ways to manipulate the Turkey for their economy and for their ambitions to seek control of their sea. You know, that's if you are in a Turkey mainland, you jump in the sea, you find yourself in the Greece territorial water. So it's a quite bizarre situation in this region. And historically, Turkish, they need to go to war every 100 years. So now they try to play a game between Russia and Turkey. They have a good relationship, economic relationship, billions of dollars between Russia and Turkey. In Libya, they sit like an enemy, but they are not an enemy because they are used themselves against the European Union, because the Libya, Turkish fear knocking in the European Union to join the European Union for how many years? For 35 years. They still knocking in the door. They saying they did everything, even the price on their products. And in the street of Istanbul, you find two prices. One is in a euro and one in a Turkish lira. Why? Because they are looking hardly to join these things. Now the Erdogan, they try to take it by revenge, occupying Libya, control European Union from south, squeeze the pipeline. You know, there's a green gas pipe coming from Melita in Libya. Eni gas operate this line. Try to occupy it also, or put an influence in the debate which is going in Algeria, in Tunis as well. So he's playing with many things, using the national and the brotherhood and the dream of the ordinary Turkish people to bring a good Islamic government. As your guest from the United States said, they still Turkish as Islamists, but they are playing card with everybody.
Harpar, what did you think of Dr. Agniea's thesis? I'm not sure I agree with it entirely myself, that all the Libyans are against the foreign intervention. He made the point that all the Libyans have Omar Mukhtar in their heart, and they, in the end, are Libyan patriots and nationalists. Is that how it looks to you?
No, it doesn't look to me like that. It's impossible for imperialism to operate in any land without some local flunkies. And there are flunkies, because the Libyan opposition is made up of royalists, supporters of the former King Idris, feudalists who did not want any of the radical reforms that were introduced subsequently in Libya, and it's composed of Islamic fundamentalists who are closer to Al-Qaeda and Saudi Arabia, etc. It's composed of people who treat Africans with contempt, and hence the slave markets there. It's composed of people who opposed Libya's policy of helping fellow African countries and even beyond, everywhere. So it's a very reactionary opposition, and these people have not gone. And they are there, and imperialism makes pretty good use of them. I mean, Haftar's story is a completely different story. It's another one. You know, he
did live in Virginia for quite some time.
30 years, and he was captured in Chad when Libyan troops went there. Then he changed sides, and he was brought back literally later on by US imperialism, like various Iraqis were brought in on American tanks to Iraq.
Including the Iraqi Communist Party, incidentally.
Well, yes, I mean, there's no shortage of renegades in that circle either. And so this is precisely what was happening. People, or our own Stop the War coalition, they cannot see things below the surface, and in the end, really become allies of imperialism. Whether they wish to or not, I don't actually want to impute motives to them, but that's precisely what happens.
Ella, Scott Ritter, he said something there which echoed in part what you said in the beginning, that the United States bore primary responsibility for what has happened in Libya, which virtually everyone could agree is now a disaster area. But if you read President Obama's memoirs, as I have forced myself to do, he says that Libya was the worst mistake of his presidency. It's my belief, and I was in the British Parliament at the time, that actually the primary responsibility for the disaster lies in London and Paris more than it lies in Washington, that the Obama administration had to be rather pulled into the war on Libya. Do you see it that way or not?
Well, it was all about oil at the end of the day. There was also the whole issue that Gaddafi was looking for a way of introducing a currency that would be a substitute for the dollar. And that, I think, was seen as a big threat in Wall Street. Of course, the French were very much at the forefront of saying, go in there and beat them all up. I'm not sure that the British were as keen as the French, but maybe my memory is failing me there. So there were a whole...
Remember that scene, I'll never forget it. You'll definitely never forget it, of Sarkozy and Cameron in Benghazi declaring for democracy and so on.
Yeah.
It was quite interesting there were no Americans on the stage.
Yeah.
They may already have been having second thoughts. Let's hear from Dr. Mustafa Fetouri. He's in Paris, in France. He's a Libyan academic in management and an award-winning journalist and analyst. He's a recipient, for what it's worth, of the EU's Freedom of the Press Prize. Dr. Mustafa, welcome.
Pleasure.
Which countries, if any, have the upper hand in Libya now?
Well, there is no, one Libya. Unfortunately, there is no one Libya to say that certain country has an upper hand over Libya as a whole, but we have a host of countries. In Eastern Libya, I would say Russia and United Arab Emirates and Egypt have the upper hand in terms of military as well as politics, political maneuvering, and even the mediation led by the United Nations mission in that regard. In Western Libya, where you have the government of national accord, which is recognized by the United Nations as the only legitimate government of Libya, you have the Turks and the Italians, but mostly the Turks. The overall picture, I would say, at the moment, Turkey and Russia are have the upper hand in Libya, and I would guess also nothing much could happen without them.
Could other powers, the US, for example, intervene and maybe introduce new resolutions?
Well, I'm not sure if they are willing, first of all, and if they are willing, then the next question, how far they are prepared to go. If we start with the EU, which has a huge stake in Libya, because of the proximity of the country, just 1 hour flight from Rome, and the issue of the legal migrants, as well as trafficking of people, trafficking of drugs, and you name it. I am not sure the EU really is capable of delivering actual, say, boots on the ground in Libya for example, sustaining peace on the ground, The idea of having boots, European boots in the ground, has been discussed last October in the European Union, and it was immediately dropped because of the high risk of the operation itself, the high political cost to it. So the Europeans can hardly agree, as we know, in any external military operation, despite the fact that they committed a huge sin against Libya in 2011 when they supported the crazy Nicolas Sarkozy and his attack in Libya, launching the wider NATO attack in the country. That's for the EU.
What do you think President Biden will do in a tattered Libya?
For the US, I think with the country, with the America divided as it is today, and with Biden having so much trouble and so many problems, complicated one domestically to start what he has to handle, I am not sure he will have the time for Libya. And I must recall here that Mr. Biden, when he was a vice president to Barack Obama, in 2011, he actually rejected the idea of military intervention in Libya, and he only changed his mind afterwards because his boss, wanted to go ahead with the military intervention, and the end is here. I know that the end product of Libya, we see it today, we live it today. And I remember also from press reports, Mr. Biden at the time asked the simple question, what will happen to Libya once the Gaddafi regime was toppled? And nobody gave him an answer at the time. And 10 years later, nobody is able to give him an answer, not even himself as a president of the United States. So I'm not sure either countries, whether the EU or the US will be able to do much in Libya. It has to go back to Russia and Turkey. And unfortunately, and of course, their Libyan proxies, without the Libyan local proxies and agents, if you like, we wouldn't have that situation anyway.
That all sounded quite plausible to me, Doctor. Just Libya's the scramble for Africa of 19th century in microcosm. You have all these imperialist countries swarming over your country and its resources and its strategically important place on the map in the world. But only one power really has a plan, and that power is Turkey. What did you think of that thesis?
No, it's a dream, not a plan. Like you say, Erdogan dream is talking. He talking that he will bring the Ottoman Empire. He talk about he doesn't have troop in the ground, and after, let's say, his victory or the colony agents, which is controlled Tripoli, they say their victory, he came over and he admire the troop and they give them certificate, and even he bring his actors to play with them in New Year Eve. So the presence of their troops in the ground is really, that's why all the Libyans know that the mercenary and the Turkish troop, they are in Libya, they're working for their interests. So he speak out and he dream of controlling Libya. That's why I said most of the Libyan, they are against the Western interference, and they listen. Even a few of them, they're still working in this for their personal interest, and they're still the agents for the imperialism or for the Turkish, for everybody. Throw any piece of meat to them to eat it. Even if they throw them their children or their grandma or their country history. Like what happened when the Islamic fascists controlled Libya. One of them is Belhaj. He controlled Tripoli. What he did, because he had a problem with the United Kingdom, they catch him, and because there's a security deal to exchange the criminal around the world. So he was one of the part of the exchange between Libyan government, which is the Gaddafi era, and United Kingdom government. So there is some sort of deal. What he did simply, he had all the security archive which is belonged to Libya, not to the Gaddafi regime or to anybody regime. And he delivered it simply to his lawyer office or anything to just defeat him. So that's the sort of agent Libya had, and as a source of disease, as a source of destruction of the country, as a source of wolf who bring every mercenary to their country to control the oil and to control the money and control the Tripoli. They don't get out of Tripoli. Even when we say a legitimate government, it's not a legitimate government. It's born in Skhirat, in Maghreb, and it's just between some sort of party, and simply the United Nations give them as a recognized country. How dare we can call them as a recognized government? They don't have legitimacy from the Libyan parliament. They don't have legitimacy from the Libyan people, and they control Tripoli. Do you know what, George? They don't travel. They don't get out of Tripoli for 15 kilometers, for about 10 miles. They don't go. They couldn't go because the situation is not they controlling. There's militia. Arms control each base. The Misrata, for example, militia of the Misrata, they are controlling, they are country inside the country. They have some imperialism fascists to go to the Turkey, to go to everybody, to seek the money, to have the power, to stay in control. But the Libyan patriot nationalists, they are against the intervention. And they learned the lesson very hard from 2011, and they know no such things called freedom and democracy coming in the golden plate from the others, because the others, they all controlled by their gratitude, by their means, what they can get from the country. Yes, Libya is a far country, very wide. We have controls. We have France in one hand. And when Libyan introduced the idea of the golden dinar, Libyan golden dinar or African golden dinar, is afraid of not Paris, it's the whole Francophone countries, which is half of the Africa. When you talk about Africa, you talk about the Commonwealth. Half of it is the Anglophone countries. So you are not playing with Africa, you're playing in London and in Paris. So that's the major mistake the previous regime or the Gaddafi, he made at the end when the 2011 came for some sort of needs and just or copying what happened in Tunisia or what happened in Egypt, the whole other internationals player, they jumped to the Tripoli. Yes, there's a picture where you say, I saw Sarkozy and Cameron, and we didn't see American, but the other American, he came out alone, and he's just wandering around, and he know he can control everything. Nowadays, the file of the Libya is the hand of the American in terms of the external intervention, not the internal. The internal, they start struggling, and they will deliver one day either a revolution, the whole revolution, or something. They kick out those imperialism agents or the tail of the Erdogan. And Erdogan, we are not responsible about the dream of Erdogan, because the dream of Erdogan and taking the country to the war with the neighbors, it will end him inside Turkey, not
maybe. Dr. Mustafa, what does Turkey want to achieve in Libya?
Well, they would like to achieve a lot. I'm not very, I'm not very certain about the Russians, because the Russians they don't appear to have a very sustained long-term plan or a goal in Libya, unlike the Turks. Mr. Erdogan has a very long-term plan for Libya, very strategic plan for Libya. He wants to maintain two things, a favorable government in Tripoli, so he could get away with many projects in the future he is going to do with the Libyan authorities, the relevant Libyan authorities in Tripoli. And two, the military, of course, the military presence. He already has a control of at least two different bases, one in what we are in the western, southwestern of Tripoli, and one is the maritime naval force base in Misrata, west of Tripoli along the coast. So plus, of course, the economic benefits, including Libya's oil, the construction deals, or Turkey is already a manufacturer of something like $20 billion worth of contracts that were signed with the previous regime before 2011. The Turks want to make sure that they don't lose this. And most importantly of all, the maritime border agreement that was signed in November 2009 between the government of Turkey and the government of National Accord in Tripoli, which gave Turkey much more than it could ever dream of in the Mediterranean region, east, west, south, north.
And finally, in your view, Doctor, how could liberty and peace be returned to Libya?
Well, as you know, George, Libya has been always at the crossroads, of superpowers and different influences. And the only period that actually the country enjoyed some kind of 99% independence, I would say, was during the Gaddafi period. And that's why he was hated by the West, especially the Americans. And we already know the numerous attempts in his life, directly or indirectly. So what really will bring Libya back to where it was March 2011, I'm not sure there will be anything to do that. I guess the overall objective of the military intervention that led to the destruction of Libya itself and the murder of Gaddafi in broad daylight was to make sure that such a patriotic regime will never emerge in Libya again, like we see in Iraq, the situation in Iraq. If you look at that, it's more or less the same thing that's happening in Libya. So, but basically, the main problem in the country, in Libya now, that makes Libyans so arguing with each other and it's difficult to reconcile them, is the fact of the military, foreign intervention, either politically or military or you name it, economically, financially, you name it. And those countries, including Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Russia, Egypt, you name it, they cannot meddle in our affairs unless they find people inside the country who are capable to cooperate with them.
Are you optimistic?
Unless we cut that link between the local forces, local politicians and tribes and so on and so forth, with the external forces, external regional or international forces, then we cannot do much with the country. And I'm afraid the situation we are in today is likely to go on for another decade.
Harper, last word to you. As we both know, sometimes the enemy struggles mightily to lift a huge stone only to drop it on its own feet. Is that what's happened here? We heard from Scott Ritter, I personally believe this, that in Washington there is a feeling that it would have actually been better to leave Gaddafi there. After all, he was playing ball, he was disarming, he was giving out contracts, even bribes to Western politicians. And now they have a totally unpredictable set of potential outcomes. Russia could come out on top. Erdogan, a flunky, but one that cannot be relied upon. Do you think maybe it's a stone that they've dropped on their own feet?
Who?
Imperialism.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's not really, forget about the monkeys, look at the organ grinders. I think if you look at American imperialism, the state in which it is, the seeds of its own destruction are there, and they are not actually laid by just chance. It's the wars they've been waging ever since the Second World War, which have slowly but surely destroyed their whole prestige and their whole moral effect that they had on people, misconceived in my view. They never had any. They should never have had any.
But they had soft power.
They had soft power. That has disappeared, and you can see what is happening in Washington these days. It's a wonderful sight. As Chairman Mao once famously said during the War of Liberation against Japan, there is chaos everywhere under heaven. The situation is wonderful. I mean, this chaos, I don't know why people are saying, oh, well, you know, we want a rules-based order. What they want to do is want to go back to pre-Trump days where everybody was singing from the same hymn sheet. Americans gave orders, and the junior imperialist partners, as well as their flunkies in the third world, followed suit. Now everybody has got their own agenda. I mean, the very people who wouldn't dare say boo to Trump are now demanding that he should be cut off from the social media. They're demanding he should be prosecuted. They're demanding he should be impeached. Impeached for doing exactly the same thing that the previous administrations were doing. What was he wanting to do? He was trying basically to say, my election is stolen. Well, for 4 years, this was the mantra that the Democratic Party indulged in, that he's stolen the election because of Russian interference. And Trump quite rightly said, be careful what you wish for. They are actually creating the seeds of their own destruction. And I think they will be, in the end, brought down by the American people. You might have had very little hope from the American people, but times they are changing, you know, and times are changing. There is far more a stir in the American population. They don't trust their government. It's a least trusted government in the Western world, and they don't trust because every time they have been asked to believe something, it's turned out to be a lie. They're slow learners, but they're learning, and that's precisely what is happening. They've dropped several rocks on their own feet.
I'm going to quit while I'm ahead. Harpar Brar quoting Bob Dylan. The times they are a-changing indeed. Well, there's much more to be said, but no more time to say it. Thanks for watching Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen Television with George Galloway.